Good evening, everyone. Was talk with Karen a little bit, and she says a lot of people are on St. Regis time, so they'll still be trickling in a little bit. But anyhow, when we finished our session last week, Florence distributed the little handout that Monsignor asked us to distribute. So, as she called it last week, your homework in preparation for tonight. So, I think you're going to be in for a nice talk this evening entitled Lights of Hope. Just a little bit about Monsignor Statnik. He was ordained in May of 1973. He attended St. Mary's College in Baltimore a couple different times, I think, if I got my information correct, earning the bachelor's degree as well as an STM and an STL. Formerly was a member of the Sulpician Fathers, teaching in numerous seminaries across the country. In 1986, he came to Greensburg Diocese and was vocation director for about 3 years, and probably doesn't remember it, but you were the first vocation director I ever met in Greensburg.
I do remember.
You do remember that? Okay. Great memories. He has served as Vicar General for our diocese and served in various parishes in our diocese, and currently he is the pastor of St. Sebastian's Parish in Bell Vernon. And so without anything else, Monsignor, it's a pleasure to have you with us this evening. Thank you for joining us.
You forgot to say I went to Notre Dame because I'm a huge fan. So. Okay. Well, it's nice to be with you. And that little article you got was simply to sort of stimulate the thought a little bit. A little bit of background to that. When I first went to Bell Vernon about 4 years ago, the facilitator of the Pastoral Council said one night after our meeting, "You need to write something for the bulletin. Write about your cat." And so that's what started Baxter. But the problem is Baxter's become a monster for me because everybody wants to hear about Baxter. They don't care about me. They want to hear about Baxter. And so every week I got to produce this thing. So I figured out a way that I could give myself a break. So Baxter goes on vacation every summer. So for 3 months, Baxter has nothing to say, and then he comes back. I've been asked to talk about the light of hope in light of Pope Francis's call to every Christian, and certainly every Catholic believer, to be a light of hope in our world today. Now that's a pretty tall order if you think about what has happened in our world in just the last decade and a half. Within that time, major events have occurred that have in many ways shattered our hope. I think the first and probably most dramatic and the reference event for that is 9/11, isn't it? Remember that day? Remember how absolutely flabbergasted we were that this could happen. After all, we're the United States of America. We are invincible, we thought. We were never struck on our home shores, the mainland, by any kind of major attack until then. We didn't think it could happen. We were too powerful, too strong, too intelligent. And we began to lose hope in our power. And then remember the financial crisis of 2008. We were on a wave of prosperity. The stock market was booming. Home ownership was never that high. Employment, upward mobility, they were all there. We were the masters of our own destiny. The American dream was real. With hard work, with maybe a little risk, with some good luck, things would just keep getting better and better and better. And now we see we're so naive, weren't we? And we were deceived. We were deceived by our own experts. Personal greed trumped our common sense, and even more, it trumped the common good. And then thirdly, there's all that social crisis that has come upon us in the last 15 years, isn't it? Social crisis in the church, social crisis in government, in sports, in education. It's everywhere. I don't have to tell you about the scandals of sex abuse in the church that shocked everyone who was part of this. How could this happen? And then even more so, how could people cover it up? Where can you feel safe if it could happen here? How about the sports heroes? You know, kind of the icons of American success and power were seen as thugs, philanderers. And again, they had their accomplices. Or the government figures. I guess it can reach back even beyond 15 years to Watergate. And then we have all of the scandals that keep seeming to unfold. Government people using their positions for their own benefit. And teachers, they forfeited their roles as mentors and shapers of character to become the lovers of their students in some cases. In all these situations, it was people in power use their power for their own benefit, their own gratification, their own protection. It's easy to lose hope, isn't it? And I think if we're honest, we have to say we've all been tarnished by these events. In our efforts at success, we see that maybe we have lost what really makes us good and generous. Well, what do we do about this picture? One might not want to look at it. And there are a lot of people, even today, that don't want to look at it. Well, why do you bring all of that stuff up? There's some people who want to deny it. Oh, the media created that problem. Or the lawyers created that problem. And some people want to diminish the impact of it all and find someone else to blame. But if we want to reclaim our hope, we have to begin from where we are. We can't deny it or diminish it. We have to take it in full view. And that's because hope begins in what is, so that it can take us to what we want to be. But if you don't look squarely at what is, you can never go to a better place. We'll never have a better future if we don't own the enemies of hope that are in our midst. And what do those enemies of hope do to us? I really think there are some foundations to hope that are in our character. And the enemies of hope try to take those foundations away, to deteriorate them, to denigrate them, or to do away with them altogether. And I'd like you to consider 5 foundations. Things in us as human beings, as individuals and as a community that we have to have if we are going to hope. And it was those things that were attacked by all of those events that have occurred in the last couple decades. The first thing I would ask you to consider is honesty. We cannot hope unless we're honest. And what do we mean by honesty? Honesty is the correspondence between what we say and do and what we claim about what we say and do. There's a lot of dimensions to that correspondence, aren't there? If you think about it. For instance, there's the private and the public version of events. Today, we seem to be very at ease with saying the public and the private versions can be different. There's the facts, and then there's our description of the facts. We're very comfortable with spin doctors, aren't we? The only problem is if everybody's a spin doctor, where's the center? Where's the correspondence between what we do and what we claim? There's all sorts of ways in which we can deal with generalities, aren't there? But we don't make them fit the particulars of life. And that's another dimension to our honesty. Words, pictures, sounds can all be manipulated to point to a particular party's interest rather than to point to the shared interest of everyone. Without honesty, hope can't get its bearings. Without honesty, we don't know where we are when we begin. And so, we can't get better. Hope has to be truthful. If it isn't that, it's tempted to become a fantasy. And a fantasy isn't hope. You know, people love to go to Disney World. But Disney World doesn't feed anyone's hope. It feeds their fantasies. They have a good time. But it doesn't feed their hope. If hope is not built on honesty and truthfulness, it can prevent critical judgment and just uphold the status quo. And that's a very, very dangerous position to be in, because then people will use your hope to get their way. The second foundation in us to hope is integrity. Integrity conveys a sense that the parts fit together to create a whole picture of who I am and what we're dealing with. You know, as human beings, we really don't like loose ends, do we? We fear things will unravel when life is just a series of individual or isolated facts or rules or experiences. Did you notice how often, though, today we're trapped in that? You have a really good time one night, but it doesn't connect to anything else. It's just a good time. Or our kids learn a whole bunch of facts. They can manipulate the computer like geniuses. But they don't know what's the purpose to do that. Integrity is knowing how the pieces fit into the whole. While there are numerous issues that need to be addressed in our very pluralistic world today, we disorient ourselves and set up unintended competitions when we commit to a specific issue without seeing how it fits into the whole picture. You know, our government's at a standstill because it's driven by interest groups. See, everybody's got their thing, their piece that they want. But we're having an awful time putting the pieces together into a whole picture of who are we as a people and what do we want to become as that people. Without integrity, hope flounders in a collection of improvement projects. And everybody wants their project to be funded and succeed. But the problem is, in the end, even if they get their project and it succeeds, now what? Now what? Where do we go from here? The third point of foundation for hope is safety. To be a hopeful person, we have to have a sense that our well-being is protected and respected. A person can't have hope if they're under constant, intentional, and targeted threat, whether that threat is physical or emotional or psychological. Our instinct is, in those kinds of circumstances, is then to become self-protective. And once we get into that, that forces us to think and act only for our own well-being without regard for others. Without safety, a person becomes narcissistic. And his or her world is reduced to what they see, what they want, what they have, and what they can get. That's why terrorism is so terrible. Terrorism is a threat to everyone's well-being. And if we live under that threat constantly, we cannot hope. If we live on high alert at all times, we can't think of anything else but our own safety. We see everyone else as a threat. And we isolate ourselves, usually in manageable circles where we feel safe. Secret cults, religious sects, gated communities, even some political movements arise from this lack of safety. Hope only has a chance when there's that basic safety need is met for people. when people have food and clothing and shelter and health and peaceful relations. If we ignore those things, we can't hope. The fourth foundation for hope is compassion. People need to know and feel that they're understood in the specific conditions of their lives, and they're regarded with respect and dignity as fellow human beings, no matter what those conditions might be. We all need to have a sense that others care about us and want things to be better for us. We need to trust that others will help us when we're in need and challenge us to do and be better without simply eliminating us from the picture. Compassion allows us to walk together through life rather than to be at each other's odds over our differences. It identifies that we hold more in common than we could ever hold apart. We see this common strain that we have before we acknowledge any differences that might separate us and isolate us. When we're compassionate, we connect on the level of our commonality first. And it's on that basis then we figure out how to live with our differences. But how often today do we identify our differences first? And then we wonder why we can't get it together. Only if we feel deep down that we're tied to each other in our yearning for a better world can we sustain ourselves in the long haul. You cannot hope in isolation and alone. Compassion gives us the reason to stick together and so to stick it out. And then you don't lose hope when we might disappoint each other or we might fail. You know, our failures breed on a lack of compassion. The last point of foundation for hope is courage. I would call courage the energy behind hope. Only with courage do we move from sort of a Pollyannish view of life, kind of stargazing about, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful, to tackling the obstacles to our vision of a better world. Courage gives us the gumption to figure out the problems rather than to be overwhelmed by them. It's the strength to face those who oppose our hope without defeating them, but rather trying to win them over to our vision by our honesty and integrity, by the safety we offer and the compassion we view them within. Courage is the fuel that sustains hope and keeps it working to change the world for the better. It won't give in to the naysayers, and it won't give up. It won't give up on convincing people that hope is worth it. Courage conditions our vision for a better world to be realistic. But also, it's always better. But also, courage asks us that things can always be better than they are at the present time. Courage won't let us rest on our laurels. It won't allow us to register our accomplishments and walk away. Courage keeps hope alive by forcing us to move ahead. Each time we want to settle down for the status quo. You know, one of the reasons that all of those crises came upon us is we did get a bit fat and happy and soft. We just began to take a lot of stuff for granted, didn't we? And I think we lost our courage to keep moving. Hope is never satisfied or finished because it's based on the courage to always move on and start again. I believe these 5 qualities of character are the foundation for hope. So how do we sustain these foundations when we're faced with the powerful, enticing, and deadly threats that have touched us so concretely and so often? We had the financial crisis, we had 9/11, we had all the social crises that still seem to be with us. So what do? Well, Pope Francis has tried to show us a way. And it's interesting to me that Francis has caught the imagination of so many people. You know, he hasn't come out with any program. You know, so often in the American church, we think that if we have a good idea, we have to make a program to make that idea real. There is no program for character. You know that. You raise kids. If you want to screw up your kid, put them in a program to become a good human being or a good Christian. And Pope Francis offers us no program, but he's caught the imagination of so many people inside and outside the church. How's he done that? What has he done? I think his guidelines for forming character that can hope are pretty simple and clear. The first fundamental guideline is we are not the source or the sustenance for our hope. We can't do that. You know, part of the reason we were knocked off our horse so brutally by those events is that I think, consciously or unconsciously, we thought we were doing it. We thought we were making it. You know, we were the United States of America. Strong, powerful, prosperous, happy. We had it all. Francis would say, that's a very dangerous position. Because you don't recognize in that position that all of the opposite vices to these virtues lie in you potentially. Because you are a sinner. because you're frail and weak, because you're the creature and not the creator. We lie, don't we? So we betray honesty. We like to separate and divide and isolate to make ourselves stronger. So we betray integrity. We threaten and destroy if we have to, so that we can get people to do what we want. And so we compromise safety. We're apathetic and selfish and self-centered at times. And so we lack compassion. And who of us haven't been cowards? Who of us haven't spoken up when we know we should have? Who of us haven't acted to help another when we know we should have? See, Francis knows that. Remember Francis going to confession? Early picture of him. Everybody's saying, never saw a Pope do that. But unless you recognize that you are a sinner, that you are weak and frail, you will compromise these virtues more than you could ever imagine, and not realize you're doing it. What does Francis say? God is the source and the sustenance of our hope. But not just any God. For Francis, it's the God that we encounter personally through the Spirit of Jesus, who showed us how to sustain hope in Him. I don't know how much you read of what Francis says, but interestingly, Pope John Paul II talked about a culture of life and a culture of death. And what Francis is proposing is a culture of encounter. Because if you look at the God of Jesus and how Jesus showed God at work in our world, it was precisely through the encounter of person to person on certain terms. These are the terms. The first one is healing. The God of Jesus encounters us through healing. Sometimes it's physical healing, literally. Sometimes it's healing the mind. Oftentimes, it was people who were just out of their mind that Jesus had to calm down. We talked about it as demons in those days. Probably today we talk about it as psychosis. It's the same thing. And Jesus heals it. And healing spiritually. Healing the spirit of humankind. When God comes to encounter us in our brokenness. The second term of this encounter with God that we see in Jesus is forgiving. Forgiving sin. which is somehow the denial that God is the source and the sustenance of all of our virtue. But healing our failures too. You know, one of the things that Jesus does besides forgiving sin is to say, let it behind. Move on. Do not allow your failures to become the points of reference for your life. And he heals the hurts. He heals the wounds that sometimes we inflict on each other, that sometimes are inflicted by life itself, by the limits of human life, inflict certain wounds upon us, don't they? Cancer, premature death. Jesus heals and forgives those who are struck by life and by each other. So healing, forgiving, feeding. Did you ever notice how much encounter occurs in the Gospels over eating? Jesus feeds the 5,000 and the 4,000. He's always concerned that people have enough to eat. He tells his disciples, "Come away with me." And in the upper room, before he dies, he feeds people. It's a basic way to feel safe and regarded and respected and understood. It's a basic way to have a sense, not an idea, but a sense that things do fit together. They do have an integrity to them. Jesus feeds the physically hungry, but also those who are hungry to understand more about themselves and their God, to understand more about their world and how they should make their way in it. Fourthly, Jesus teaches. Did you ever notice how much of the gospel is about teaching? Particularly if you read Matthew's gospel. Jesus is sort of the quintessential teacher there. Jesus is about enlightening people to what is possible in their lives. Jesus is about showing them what the kingdom of God is like. And in doing that, he brings comfort, but he also brings challenge. Some of those parables of the kingdom of God say, "Oh, thank God, it isn't all on my shoulders." It's like the mustard seed that falls into the ground. And in time, it grows up and becomes a huge bush to support the birds of the air. It's not all on my shoulders. But on the other hand, this kingdom challenges us in our attempt to encounter each other. And so you pay the workman who came in the 11th hour the same as the one who came in the first hour? Huh? That's not fair. Are you going to judge me because I'm generous? If we are to inculcate these particular qualities in ourselves, we have to find ways to teach them. Not in a didactic kind of way. In a way that allows people to enter into the life situations and make virtuous choices or see the alternative. And the last term for encountering the God of Jesus that's given to us in the gospel is just being with. Did you ever notice how often in the gospel Jesus doesn't say anything? He's just there. He's just there. And by being there, he gets people to start thinking. He gets them to start examining their lives. He gets them to start making decisions either to walk away or to come closer. In John's Gospel, when Jesus calls the first disciples, he said, "What are you looking for? And we want to follow you." And he says, well, what are you looking for? And he says, where do you live? And what does Jesus say? He doesn't give them his email address. He says, come and see. Walk with me. Walk with me. Stay with me. It's the opposite of isolating. It's the opposite of dividing. It's come and be with me. A companion and a guide on the journey of life. From birth to death and beyond. If we're to be people of hope, we have to be companions to each other. Now, where do we see this play out? Where do we see it play out in healing and forgiveness, in feeding and teaching and being simply companions? Well, Francis knows where you learn those skills. And people don't know what to make of this. But he understands it. He says the poor. The poor are the school of virtue for those who understand that our hope is in God. You'll never learn it any other way. You can only learn it by seeing healing and forgiveness and feeding and teaching and companionship among the poor. The poor stand before us today as the opposite of the crises that threaten our hope in the last 15 years. Think about it. The poor are penniless. They haven't got any money. They can't manipulate the stocks. They're not forming any derivatives. They're not pushing home buying. They're powerless. They're not on any planes going into any buildings anywhere. The poor are unprivileged. They don't use their position for their own gratification or their own advancement because they have no position to use. Doesn't mean they're more virtuous. Maybe if they had the chance, they'd do it. But guess what? Their condition sets up the condition for both of us to become virtuous. And they hold very little esteem, don't they? Both from those who aren't poor and even among each other. Some of the poor can be very vicious to each other. They don't threaten us, but if we're willing to encounter them on their terms, they will teach us. They will teach us the reason to hope. And the reason to hope is not anything that we do. It is God's grace. The poor will teach us what God's grace looks like. It'll teach us how to use that grace to make life look differently. What Francis says is we are a grace people as God's people. That means that God lives in our midst. How do we show the presence of God? By letting that gracious mystery show through how we conduct our lives. We do in our way what Jesus did in his. We have to heal and forgive and feed and teach and companion each other. God is in those actions. And when we do that, we name the presence of God. And God isn't anywhere else. If you look elsewhere, you won't find the God of Jesus. You might find a God, some God that someone wants to create, but you won't find the God of Jesus. Francis says you must embrace those poor in order to understand God's grace in your life. Why does he create these images where he, hugs these people who are distorted? Because that's what God looks like. You see the encounter? The encounter between what is whole and what is broken, and when it comes together, creates a new whole. A better whole. A whole that's holy, divine, and not just some kind of glitzy thing that human beings put together. We are a grace people. We are God's people. And that means that God's power works in our midst. And how do we see it? I don't think we see it just in the big moves. There are big moves every once in a while. We just celebrated the anniversary of Selma. It's a big move of the power of God. The power of God prevailing through these virtues that were formed in those actions of Jesus. Ain't perfect, but it's there. Or in the defeat of Nazism. But whenever there is an influence of the good that's felt in a situation, there is the power of God. In most of our lives, it's much less dramatic, isn't it? The good is a force for good which shows itself in many ways, sometimes not in ideal ways. but its effect is felt making the situation better or even holy. You know, I've had a couple cases of this now. And I pondered this, and I said, you know, this is the way it works. We're always looking for the perfect situation, the perfect encounter. And unless it's perfect, we think it's ungodly. But Jesus didn't look for it that way. He looked for something that was good enough to break open the grace that's there in life because God made all life. In the community where I am, it's mainly older people. And one of the things that I've encountered is women usually live longer than men. So there's a lot of widows. But every once in a while, men end up having their spouse die before them. I've encountered a couple situations where this elderly woman and this elderly man get together. But they don't want to get married because it's an economic and financial mess. And you know, according to the rules of the church, this causes a quandary. You got to scratch your head. What are you going to do here? I mean, my God, you know, they're living in sin. Then inevitably, one of the partners gets sick. And the other nurses them to their death. That's holy. It's not perfect. It's not perfect. It's a mess. But it's holy. That's where we find hope. You know, too often we think unless it's perfect, there's no good there. It seems to me that's why Francis gets himself in all these jams. See, because he sees the holy in the mess. And they think that he's, you know, condoning the whole thing. He's not condoning the whole thing. He's just willing to accept the messiness of human nature and yet discover the presence and the power of God in the mess. And it seems to me that as Christian believers, that's our job, to point that out. To point that out and to encourage it. To encourage it more and more and more. Because the more we encourage it, the more folks there will be who will make the holy in the mess of their lives. The only way that we're defeated is if we squelch the holy. You'll never be defeated by sin. Isn't that what Jesus said? You'll never be defeated by evil. Isn't that what Jesus said? It's only by squelching the holy that you will be defeated because you don't know you're redeemed. Pope Francis calls for us to be lights of hope. I would modify the Pope's call a bit. I would say that Christ is the light of hope. And you see that so clearly in the Church's Easter Vigil liturgy. You know, the first words that are proclaimed is Christ our light in the darkness. That's powerful, powerful stuff. You can't explain it. You just have to be there and be part of it. And then you know it's true. Christ is the light. But we are the windows. We are the windows through which people can see the light. We can provide the means to see God's grace present and powerful in our world. And the windows may be streaked and smudged. They might even be a little broken and cracked, but that doesn't matter. You can still see through them to the light who is Christ. By being people of honesty, integrity, safety for others, people who understand compassion and courage as Jesus showed us, by healing and forgiving and feeding and teaching and being companions even unto death. By being people who see the poor as providing us the opportunity to see how grace works. Then the light of Christ will shine through us. And we will know why we hope. And we can show others why they can hope too. That's it. That was great timing. I was told to stop at 7:15. So it's 7:15. So, anybody have any questions?
I was just going to ask that. Thank you, Monsignor. Any questions?
You can disagree with me.
One back here, please.
Oh, yeah.
I cannot read the newspapers anymore. I can't read the newspapers anymore. It's all bad news.
Mm-hmm.
I hear the news bad.
Mm-hmm.
I just, when it used to be, when we lived in Toledo, Ohio, we had a peach section inside the paper. Nothing but good news.
Yeah.
And we kids would just run out, throw the rest of the newspaper away, and read this, beautiful stories at Christmas time and throughout the year we have updating stuff. It's very hard to live in a world
Well, you're bombarded.
bombarded by all
You're right.
this. And even in the midst of tragedies, to see the good that came out of 9/11,
Yeah.
see those firemen going up the steps when people were trying to escape,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that they were going to die, that they had to do something. And just seeing people in the midst of danger, exhibiting all those beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, I do think, 9/11, for all of its tragedy, does. In any tragedy, I think you'll also find some human nobility. Now, whether or not it's always reported, I thought it was kind of ironic that, remember that shrine that grew in New York in, what was the park? Union Square. Union Square. I thought it was pretty ironic. I did my doctoral work on Dorothy Day. And guess where the Catholic workers started? Union Square. They went there on May 1st, 1933 to sell the first issue of the Catholic Worker at Union Square. And here, all these years later, this becomes this kind of shrine of prayer. I mean, tragedy also brings out the worst in human beings. It really does. It becomes sort of that point of, that breaking point between either the best or the worst will come out. Why do people loot? It really is that selfish greed thing. But then on the other hand, people are carrying other people, risking their lives, going back into the building to try to save someone else. What I would urge you to is, this is not a political announcement, but the Post-Gazette once a week publishes this thing on page 2 called Random Acts of Kindness. And it's letters that people write in about random acts of kindness, nice things that people did that they didn't have to do. And so there is some hope in that. What I think the part of the problem is we still haven't gone over our greed. We don't like to say that about ourselves. Did you notice how the church didn't preach very much about greed when this whole damn thing collapsed? And I was thinking, where are we? That's one of the capital sins, but nobody's talking about it. We'll talk about sex, but we won't talk about greed. Why do they report every murder, every rape, everything? Because it sells. That's why they do it. It sells. When are we going to stop buying? That's really the issue. Now I also don't want to live in a world where we put our head in the sand and say, oh, everybody is nice and good and beautiful. We need to know that. I think the issue is having some context for that. Anymore, there's no context. There's simply description. And the juicier the description, the more it sells. I think that takes the humanity out of it at all. And I think that's terrible. We are bearing the effects of this, and I think we need to take that seriously. In some ways, the social fabric is unraveled. I don't know how it is here. I know in the valley where I am, I've said this, the social fabric's unraveling. So it seems to me that as Christians, we can't just be going to church and saying our prayers. We got to try to knit together that social fabric again. We got to do things that do that. Because that to me is kind of a basic call from the gospel. But you're right. Yeah, it's tough out there. But I think, are we going to try to do, a counterweight to this? I don't like the metaphor of culture wars. I think that's, in a sense, you're buying into the problem when you use that metaphor. I think that's the wrong metaphor. That's why I think Francis is a genius. It's the culture of encounter. It's not being at war with each other and who's going to win. It's how are we going to meet? The issue is how are we going to meet so that everyone wins? And so that the truth, how honest people of integrity who are safe and have compassion and courage, how are they going to meet? That's what we got to do. If we're out there just fighting the enemy, you might find the enemy in yourself. See, because the problem is when you get into this fighting mode, we are not immune to sin. So you can easily fall over the edge on the other side and begin to become your enemy. You've got to be careful of that, I think. So he sets a different agenda. I'm not out there fighting anybody. I just want to meet you. Let me meet you, and let's talk about what we're hoping for in life. That's all. Anything?
Thank you very much.
Don't forget, next week is Dr. Nemi from the Catholic Charities talking about how do we deal with violence and suffering without losing our faith. So we can build on what he has said and finish up next week with Dr. Nemi.
And remember, don't fight our